On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, the sky over Hawaii looked peaceful. The water of Pearl Harbor was calm. Ships rested in neat rows. Sailors woke slowly into a Sunday routine. Some prepared for breakfast. Some wrote letters home. Some looked toward a day of rest beneath the bright Pacific sun. Then, in the distance, shapes appeared in the sky. At first, they were only dots. Then they became aircraft. Then came the sound. Engines diving metal. Explosions. Within minutes, the harbor was burning. Battleships were torn open. Men were thrown into oil-black water. Smoke climbed into the Hawaiian morning, and the United States, a nation still divided over war, was suddenly pulled into the greatest conflict in human history. But Pearl Harbor was not just a surprise attack. It was the final move in a much longer story. A story of empire, fear, oil, pride, humiliation, military ambition, and a gamble so enormous that even some of the men who planned it understood it might destroy everything they were trying to protect. The real question is not simply why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The real question is this: why would Japan attack a country it knew could become more powerful than anything it could defeat? To answer that, we have to go back before the bombs, before the aircraft carriers, before the burning ships, because the road to Pearl Harbor began long before the first Japanese plane crossed the mountains of Oahu. Before the attack, Pearl Harbor looked like a place outside history. It was a naval base, yes, but it was also a human world, a world of sailors, mechanics, officers, cooks, nurses, clerks, families, and young men who had crossed an ocean without knowing that history was already moving toward them. The morning was Sunday. That mattered. Sunday carried a feeling of softness, of pause. Across the harbor, men slept late. Some prepared for church. Some joked on deck. Some looked at the battleships and saw not targets but symbols of American strength. Then the first Japanese aircraft came in low. The attack did not arrive as an argument. It arrived as sound and fire. Torpedoes cut through the water. Bombs fell from the sky. Machine guns tore across airfields. Ships that had seemed immovable began to burn. Men who had been half awake moments earlier were suddenly fighting for breath, for orders, for friends, for life. To the people inside the harbor, it felt like the beginning of the story. But it was not. Pearl Harbor was the explosion of pressures that had been building for decades. It was the moment when fear became action, when ambition became violence, and when one empire gambled that a single devastating blow could change the future. But to understand why, we have to pull back from the smoke. Because the true mystery is not how the attack happened. It is why Japan believed it had to happen. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor has often been remembered as reckless, treacherous, and shocking. It was all of those things. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper and more disturbing truth. Japan did not attack because its leaders were unaware of America's power. In fact, some of them understood it clearly. They knew the United States had a larger economy. They knew American factories could produce ships, aircraft, weapons, and fuel on a scale Japan could not match. They knew that if the war became long, industrial, and total, Japan would be in mortal danger. And yet they attacked anyway. That is what makes Pearl Harbor so haunting. It was not simply a decision made in ignorance. It was a decision made under pressure by men who believed their alternatives were disappearing. Japan wanted an empire. It wanted security. It wanted resources. It wanted recognition as a great power. But every step it took toward those goals created new enemies, new demands, and new dangers. By 1941, Japanese leaders looked at the map and saw a trap. To retreat would mean humiliation. To continue would require oil. To seize oil would risk war. And if war was coming, they believed they had to strike first. This is the tragic logic at the heart of Pearl Harbor. Japan attacked not because it was certain of victory, but because it feared slow defeat. And in that fear, it chose a gamble that changed the world. To understand Pearl Harbor, we have to understand the Pacific not as empty ocean, but as a world of competing dreams. For the United States, the Pacific was a frontier of trade, naval power, missionary ambition, and strategic security. America had interests in the Philippines, ties to China, and a growing belief that no single empire should dominate Asia. It saw itself, at least in its own telling, as defending an open international order. For Japan, the Pacific looked different. Japan was an island nation with few natural resources and a deep memory of vulnerability. It had watched Western powers carve up Asia. It had seen China weakened, colonized, and humiliated. It had learned that in a world ruled by empires, weakness invited domination. So Japan came to believe that survival required strength, and strength required empire. Here was the fatal contrast. America saw Japanese expansion as aggression. Japan saw American resistance as encirclement. America spoke of principles and stability. Japan spoke of security and destiny. Each side believed the other was blocking its rightful future. But this conflict did not begin in Hawaii. It began in Japan's earlier fear of being swallowed by the same imperial world it would later try to dominate. Before Japan became the attacker, it had first been a nation terrified of becoming the victim. And that fear would transform everything. In the 19th century, Japan looked out at Asia and saw a warning. China, once the great civilization of East Asia, had been weakened by Western gunboats, unequal treaties, foreign concessions, and humiliating defeats. European empires had taken territory across the world. Britain ruled India. France moved into Southeast Asia. Russia expanded across Siberia. The United States pushed across the Pacific. The message seemed brutally simple. The modern world did not respect ancient dignity. It respected steel, ships, industry, money, and guns. When Western warships forced Japan to open itself to the outside world in the 1850s, many Japanese leaders understood the danger. Isolation could no longer protect them. Tradition alone could not stop cannon fire. If Japan remained weak, it might become another victim of empire. So Japan learned a hard lesson from the very powers it feared: modernize or be conquered. This lesson was both defensive and dangerous. At first, Japan's transformation was about survival. It wanted to avoid the fate of colonized nations. But over time, the tools of survival became tools of ambition. The fear of domination slowly became the desire to dominate. And that is one of history's darker patterns. A nation wounded by the threat of empire may come to believe that only by building its own empire can it remain safe. Japan would not be weak, but this determination carried a shadow. The Meiji Restoration transformed Japan with astonishing speed. In a few decades, the country built modern schools, factories, railways, shipyards, banks, and government institutions. Samurai privilege gave way to national conscription. Old feudal domains were replaced by a centralized state. The emperor became the symbolic heart of a new national identity. Japan did not simply copy the West, it remade itself to compete with the West. The result was extraordinary. A country that had been forced open by foreign pressure became one of the most modern powers in Asia. Its leaders studied European armies, British naval power, German organization, and American industry. They understood that modern war was not just fought by soldiers. It was fought by entire societies. But this rebirth came with a cost. The new Japan placed enormous value on loyalty, sacrifice, hierarchy, and national mission. Military service became a way to bind citizens to the state. The emperor was elevated as a sacred figure above politics. The army and navy were not just institutions, they were guardians of national destiny. This created strength, but also danger. The same reforms that protected Japan from colonization also made expansion feel like proof of national greatness. If the West had built empires and called it civilization, why should Japan not do the same? Japan had learned to survive in an imperial world. But this would not last as mere survival. Soon, victory itself would become addictive. Japan's first great victories changed how the nation saw itself. In 1895, Japan defeated China, shocking those who still saw China as the old center of East Asian power. Japan gained territory, prestige, and confidence. It had proven that modernization could defeat tradition. Then came an even greater shock. In 1905, Japan defeated Russia. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had defeated a major European empire in a large-scale war. Across Asia, colonized peoples watched with awe. In the West, observers reacted with surprise and unease. Japan was no longer merely a student of imperial power. It had become a player in the imperial game. But victory carries its own poison. Japan's military and political elites absorbed a dangerous lesson. Bold action could change reality. If war was planned well, if the first blow was decisive, if the enemy was shocked before it could respond, Japan could overcome larger powers. This belief became part of the national imagination. Risk began to look like courage. Expansion began to look like destiny. Military success began to silence caution. Here we see the distant shadow of Pearl Harbor. Decades before Japanese aircraft crossed the Hawaiian sky, Japan had already learned to trust the power of the decisive blow. But by the 1930s, that belief would pull Japan into a conflict far larger and darker than its earlier wars. The empire that had refused weakness was about to become trapped by its own hunger for strength. By the 1930s, Japan was no longer just seeking respect. It was seeking resources, territory, and control. Manchuria, in northeastern China, became the great temptation. It offered land, coal, iron, railways, and strategic depth. To Japanese military officers, it looked like a solution to almost every problem. Economic pressure at home, dependence on foreign resources, and fear of Soviet power in the north. But Manchuria also revealed something deeply dangerous inside Japan's political system. In 1931, Japanese officers engineered a crisis near Mukden and used it as a pretext to seize Manchuria. Civilian leaders in Tokyo did not fully control the move. Once the army acted, the government was forced to accept the result. The occupation was dressed in the language of order and liberation, but it was an imperial conquest. Japan created the puppet state of Manchukuo and placed the last Qing emperor, Puyi, as its figurehead. It looked official, it looked structured, but beneath the surface, it was military rule serving Japanese expansion. This mattered because it showed that Japan's future was no longer being shaped only by diplomats or elected politicians. It was being shaped by officers in the field, by men who believed action mattered more than permission. Power was moving away from caution and toward force. And once force became the habit, stopping became harder. Manchuria did not satisfy Japan's hunger. It opened the door to a larger war. The war in China became the conflict Japan could neither win quickly nor leave easily. In 1937, full-scale war erupted after fighting near the Marco Polo Bridge. Japanese leaders expected another decisive campaign. They believed Chinese resistance would break. They believed military pressure could force political surrender. But China did not collapse. Instead, the war expanded across cities, rivers, railways, and countryside. Japanese forces captured major urban centers, including Shanghai and Nanjing, but the Chinese government continued fighting from the interior. Every advance demanded more soldiers, more supplies, more money, and more justification. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. The longer the war continued, the more Japan's leaders became trapped by their own previous decisions. To withdraw after so much bloodshed would make the sacrifices seem meaningless. To negotiate would anger hardliners. To escalate required more resources. Japan did not have. War became its own argument. The army said victory required one more campaign, one more offensive, one more active pressure. But each new step created more resistance and deeper isolation. At home, military influence grew stronger. Civilian leaders who favored compromise risked assassination, intimidation, or political ruin. In this atmosphere, moderation looked like weakness. Restraint looked like betrayal. Japan had entered China seeking security and prestige, but now China had become a vast trap. And as Japan sank deeper into that trap, another power was watching from across the Pacific. The United States watched Japan's war in China with growing alarm. America had long supported the idea of an open door in China, meaning no single empire should dominate Chinese markets or territory. This was partly moral language, partly commercial interest, and partly strategic calculation. Japan's expansion threatened all three. At first, America's response was cautious. The United States in the 1930s was deeply reluctant to enter another major war. Many Americans remembered the First World War with bitterness. Isolationist voices were strong. Europe was already sliding toward catastrophe, and many wanted no part in distant conflicts. But Japan's actions made neutrality harder. Reports of atrocities in China shocked American opinion. Japanese bombing of Chinese cities, attacks on civilians, and the wider brutality of occupation damaged Japan's image abroad. Washington began to see Japan not simply as a regional power, but as a destabilizing force that might overturn the balance of Asia. So the pressure increased. There were protests. There were diplomatic warnings. There were restrictions on materials useful for war. The United States offered aid to China and signaled that Japanese expansion would carry consequences. But Japan interpreted this pressure differently. Where Washington saw deterrence, Tokyo saw strangulation. Where America saw defense of international order, Japan saw Western power trying to deny it the same imperial privileges Western nations had claimed for themselves. This misunderstanding mattered because it turned diplomacy into suspicion. It made compromise feel like surrender, and it made pressure feed the very fear it was meant to restrain. Still, warnings alone did not bring Japan to Pearl Harbor. The real crisis began when pressure touched the one thing Japan's empire could not survive without: oil. Japan's empire had a fatal weakness. It needed resources it did not possess. Modern war required oil, rubber, tin, iron, aluminum, and countless other materials. Aircraft needed fuel, ships needed fuel, tanks, trucks, factories, and supply lines all depended on energy and raw materials. Japan had built a powerful military machine, but that machine ran on supplies from beyond its borders. This made Southeast Asia irresistible. To the south lay the Dutch East Indies, rich in oil. British Malaya had rubber and tin. French Indochina offered strategic bases. The entire region seemed to promise the resources. Japan needed to continue the war in China and build a self-sufficient empire. Japanese leaders called this vision the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Publicly, it was presented as a liberation of Asia from Western colonialism. But in practice, it meant Japanese domination replacing European domination. The contradiction was sharp. Japan claimed to be freeing Asia while planning to seize its resources. For Japanese strategists, the southern move seemed logical. If the empire was to survive, it needed oil. If America and Britain were blocking Japan's ambitions, Japan had to break through. But there was a terrible problem. The resources Japan needed were controlled by powers that might fight back. Moving south could mean war not only with Britain and the Netherlands, but with the United States. Japan wanted lifelines, but reaching for them might awaken giants. In 1941, the crisis became immediate. Japan moved into southern French Indochina, bringing its forces closer to British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. To Washington, this looked like preparation for a wider conquest of Southeast Asia. The American response was severe. The United States froze Japanese assets and effectively cut off oil exports to Japan. Other powers followed. For Japan, this was not just a diplomatic punishment. It was a countdown. Japan imported most of its oil. Without new supplies, its navy, air force, industry, and occupation forces would begin to weaken. It had reserves, but reserves are not security. Every month of waiting meant fewer options. Every month of diplomacy consumed the fuel that would be needed if diplomacy failed. This is why the embargo was so powerful. It did not destroy Japan instantly. It made time Japan's enemy. Inside Japanese leadership circles, the question became urgent. If Japan waited too long, it might lose the ability to fight at all. If it accepted American demands, it would have to retreat from parts of China and abandon imperial ambitions built through years of sacrifice. If it seized the oil fields by force, it risked a major war. There was no easy door left, only a narrowing corridor. And as the clock ticked louder, the idea of a first strike became more tempting. Not because it guaranteed victory, but because every alternative seemed to promise defeat. By late 1941, Japan's leaders faced a decision shaped by fear, pride, and paralysis. The United States demanded that Japan withdraw from its expansionist course, especially in China and Indochina. To American officials, this was necessary to stop aggression. To Japanese militarists, it sounded like national humiliation. They believed Japan had sacrificed too much to turn back. Too many soldiers had died. Too much prestige had been invested. Too much propaganda had promised destiny. To retreat now would not merely be policy failure. It would be dishonor. But to move forward meant war if Japan attacked south to seize the resources of Southeast Asia. The American-controlled Philippines stood across its supply routes. The U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor threatened Japanese operations. Britain and the Netherlands would also be drawn in. Japan could not simply take the oil and hope no one noticed. So the debate became brutal. Should Japan accept compromise and preserve peace, but risk the collapse of its imperial project? Or should it launch a massive offensive and gamble that speed, shock, and defensive depth could force its enemies to negotiate? Moderate voices existed, but they were squeezed from every direction. The army demanded firmness. The navy feared American power but prepared for war. Diplomats searched for formulas that politics no longer allowed. This is the tragedy of the corridor. Japan's leaders were not pushed by one cause alone. They were trapped by the combination of oil shortages, military ideology, fear of humiliation, and the belief that time was running out. Out of that corridor emerged the most dangerous idea of all. If war was unavoidable, Japan must strike first. Admiral Yamamoto was not a simple warmonger. He had studied in the United States. He understood American wealth, industry, and temperament better than many of his peers. He knew that Japan could not match the United States in a long war of factories and production lines. This made his role deeply tragic. Yamamoto opposed reckless war with America. Yet, when war became likely, he helped design the strike that would begin it. His thinking was harsh but clear. If Japan had to fight the United States, it could not wait for America to bring its full strength across the Pacific. Japan had to hit hard at the beginning. It had to cripple the Pacific Fleet, buy time, seize the southern resources, and build a defensive perimeter so costly to penetrate that America might accept negotiation. In Yamamoto's mind, Pearl Harbor was not a plan for easy victory. It was a desperate attempt to avoid immediate defeat. He understood the danger. He knew the attack might only awaken a force Japan could not control. But military planning often begins once political restraint has failed. Yamamoto was operating inside a reality he did not fully choose. That is what makes him such a compelling figure. He was both architect and skeptic, both visionary and prisoner. He saw the cliff ahead, but still helped build the road toward it, because Japan's leaders had convinced themselves there was no other path. His plan was bold, but boldness is not the same as wisdom. The plan behind Pearl Harbor had a brutal internal logic. Japan would not try to invade the American mainland. It had no realistic ability to conquer the United States. Instead, it wanted to paralyze American naval power long enough to secure its own empire. The sequence was essential. First, strike Pearl Harbor and cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Second, attack across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Third, seize oil, rubber, and strategic bases. Fourth, build a wide defensive perimeter across islands and ocean. Finally, make the cost of fighting Japan so high that the United States would negotiate rather than continue. It was a strategy built on speed and psychology. Japan believed Americans might not have the will to fight a long, bloody war across thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese leaders imagined a short window in which the shock of defeat might weaken American resolve. The attack was also shaped by naval thinking of the time. Battleships were still seen as symbols of sea power. Destroying them seemed like destroying America's ability to interfere, and at first glance, the plan had elegance. It used surprise. It attacked the enemy's strength before that strength could move. It matched Japan's best weapon, its carrier force, against American vulnerability. But hidden inside this masterstroke was a fatal flaw. The plan depended not only on what Japan could destroy, it depended on what America would feel after being attacked. And that was where Japan misread history. Pearl Harbor could succeed tactically and still fail strategically. That was the flaw at the center of the plan. Japan could sink battleships. It could destroy aircraft. It could kill thousands and shock the world. But the deeper machinery of American power did not sit only in Pearl Harbor. It lay in shipyards, factories, oil fields, railroads, steel mills, and a population that could be mobilized once anger replaced hesitation. The attack also missed crucial targets. The American aircraft carriers were not in harbor. The fuel storage tanks survived. Repair facilities remained usable. Submarine bases remained intact. Many damaged ships could be raised, repaired, and returned to service. But the greatest mistake was psychological. Japan hoped surprise would weaken American will. Instead, surprise purified it. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States was divided. After Pearl Harbor, the debate changed almost overnight. The attack created a moral clarity that political speeches had struggled to produce. It gave Americans a date, an image, a wound, and a reason. Japan had planned to buy time, but it also bought unity for its enemy. This is why the attack remains such a devastating lesson in strategy. A first blow can destroy ships, but it can also create determination. It can win a morning and lose a war. It can appear brilliant at the moment of impact, while silently setting in motion consequences. No planner can control. With the flaw already hidden inside the plan, the Japanese fleet began its journey across the Pacific. The machinery of history was now moving. In late November 1941, Japan's carrier strike force moved into the cold northern Pacific. It traveled under secrecy and radio silence, far from normal shipping lanes, through rough seas and winter weather. The force was enormous, but it had to behave like a shadow. 6 aircraft carriers carried the planes that would strike Hawaii. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and supply ships moved with them. On board, pilots prepared for a mission unlike any Japan had attempted. They studied maps of Oahu. They practiced torpedo attacks for shallow water. They reviewed targets, battleships, airfields, hangars, aircraft, naval facilities. Many understood that if the plan failed, they might never return. There is something chilling about this part of the story. The fleet crossed the ocean with discipline and technical brilliance. It showed Japan at the height of its naval skill. The planning was daring. The execution was precise. The men involved were trained, focused, and prepared to risk their lives. And yet all that skill served a catastrophic purpose. This is one of Pearl Harbor's deepest contrasts. The beauty of military precision bound to the darkness of strategic violence. While the ships pushed through the gray water, diplomats in Washington still talked. Messages moved slowly. Deadlines approached. Leaders calculated. Unknown to many sleeping in Hawaii, the attack was already on its way. History was not coming with a declaration shouted across the sea. It was coming in silence, beneath winter clouds, carried by men who believed they were securing an empire. On Oahu, life continued. Pearl Harbor was alert in some ways, but not prepared for the exact disaster approaching it. The United States knew war with Japan was possible. Officials understood that tensions were extreme. Warnings had been sent. Commands had been told to prepare against sabotage, surprise, and hostile action. But danger is not the same as imagination. Many expected an attack to come somewhere else: the Philippines, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, perhaps Guam. Hawaii seemed distant, defended, and difficult to reach. The idea of a massive carrier strike across the northern Pacific was possible, but not fully believed. So aircraft were parked closely together to guard against sabotage. Ships rested in harbor. Many anti-aircraft guns were not fully manned. Crews followed the rhythm of an ordinary Sunday. This does not make the defenders foolish. It makes the tragedy more human. In history, disaster often arrives, not because no one sees danger, but because they see it in the wrong shape. The warnings exist, but the mind arranges them into a different picture. The enemy is expected, but not here. Not now. Not like this. That morning, soldiers at radar stations saw incoming aircraft, but the sighting was misunderstood. Civilians looked toward the sky without panic. Sailors moved through morning routines. The world still felt intact. And that is what makes the next moment so devastating. For the attackers, the morning was the result of months of planning. For the men below, it was the sudden end of ordinary life. The calm could not last. The first wave was almost over Oahu. The attack began with terrifying speed. Japanese planes swept over Oahu, hitting airfields first, to prevent American fighters from rising in defense. Bombs struck hangars. Machine gun fire ripped across parked aircraft. Explosions rolled across Wheeler, Hickam, Ford Island, and other bases. Then came Battleship Row. Torpedo planes descended low over the water. Bombers climbed and dropped their loads onto ships below. The harbor filled with flame, smoke, screams, and shattering steel. The USS Arizona became the most haunting image of the attack. A bomb detonated forward ammunition magazines, and the ship erupted in a massive explosion. In moments, hundreds of men were killed. Fire and black smoke rose into the sky, turning the harbor into a scene of almost unreal destruction. Other ships were struck, rolled, burned, or sank into the shallow water. Men swam through oil and flame. Some were trapped below decks. Some fought fires while bombs still fell. Some manned guns without full orders, firing at aircraft that seemed to come from everywhere. For Japan, the attack was working. Surprise had been achieved. Battleships were being destroyed. American air power on Oahu was being crippled. But every explosion carried a consequence Japan could not see from above. Every burning ship became a memory. Every dead sailor became a reason. Every image of smoke over Hawaii became part of a national wound that would not produce surrender, but fury. Japan had struck the body of the Pacific Fleet, but it had also struck the mind of America, and that would change everything. By the time the attack ended, Pearl Harbor was devastated. Ships burned. Aircraft lay wrecked. Thousands were dead or wounded. The shock traveled across the world with extraordinary speed. Japan had achieved one of the most dramatic surprise attacks in military history. On the surface, it looked like triumph. But the victory had missing pieces. The American aircraft carriers were not in port. This mattered more than many understood at the time, because carriers would soon become the central weapon of the Pacific War. The fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor survived. The repair yards survived. The submarine facilities survived. The harbor itself remained usable. That meant Pearl Harbor was not knocked out as permanently as Japan needed. Many damaged ships were later repaired. The base continued to function. The United States still had the ability to rebuild, reorganize, and respond. This is the paradox of the attack. It was devastating, but not decisive. It was spectacular, but incomplete. It shocked America, but did not cripple America's deeper power. In the language of strategy, Japan had won a tactical victory while leaving untouched many of the tools that would allow its enemy to recover. The attack created destruction, but not paralysis. And this mattered because Japan's plan depended on time. It needed enough time to seize resources, build defenses, and make the war seem too costly for America to continue. But time was not neutral. Every day after Pearl Harbor, American anger hardened, American factories prepared, American shipyards expanded, American politics unified. Japan had won the morning, but the future was already turning against it. News of the attack reached Japanese leaders as a report of success. The fleet had crossed the Pacific undetected. The attack had achieved surprise. American battleships had been hit. The opening blow had landed. Some in Japan celebrated. To them, Pearl Harbor proved courage, discipline, and destiny. It seemed to show that Japan could strike a great power and survive. It seemed to confirm the old belief that bold action could reshape reality before enemies could respond. But not everyone felt only triumph. Yamamoto is often associated with the warning that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. The exact wording may belong more to legend than documented quotation, but the emotional truth is powerful. Yamamoto understood the danger of what had been done. Japan had not frightened America into passivity. It had given America a wound deep enough to unite it. This is where myth and truth meet. Whether or not the famous phrase was spoken exactly, the attack did awaken something. It transformed the United States from a divided nation watching war from a distance into a nation with a direct cause. Japan had attacked a weakened American will. Instead, it created a will stronger than before. That was the fatal misreading. Japanese leaders had judged American power in material terms, but underestimated American reaction to humiliation and surprise. They mistook distance for weakness. They mistook debate for cowardice. They mistook democratic hesitation for permanent paralysis. But democracies can be slow to enter wars. Once attacked, they can become relentless. And America was about to turn shock into purpose. The day after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. His words turned the attack into national memory. The 7th of December became not merely a date, but a symbol. Across the United States, newspapers carried images of burning ships and dead Americans. Radios delivered the news into homes, factories, farms, and cities. Congress declared war on Japan with overwhelming support. The internal debate over whether America should enter the war was effectively over. Isolationism did not disappear because every question had been answered. It disappeared because the nation had been attacked. Pearl Harbor made neutrality feel impossible. Recruiting offices filled. Factories prepared for war production. Shipyards accelerated. Families watched sons leave. The sleeping industrial power Yamamoto feared began to move. This was Japan's greatest miscalculation. Its leaders had hoped that a sudden strike would discourage America, or at least delay it long enough for Japan to build an empire too costly to challenge. Instead, Pearl Harbor gave America the emotional and political unity required to fight a long war. The attack also changed the global conflict. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States soon after, bringing America fully into both the Pacific and European wars. A local strike in Hawaii had become a turning point in world history. Japan had tried to control the timeline, but after Pearl Harbor, the war began moving according to a different rhythm. American production, American mobilization, American revenge, and the slow closing of the Pacific around Japan. The consequences now stretched far beyond Pearl Harbor. One morning of fire had opened the road to imperial ruin. Pearl Harbor bought Japan time, but not enough. In the months after the attack, Japan advanced rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. It captured territory, seized resources, and stunned the world with the speed of its victories. For a brief moment, the gamble seemed to be working, but this would not last. The United States repaired what could be repaired, replaced what had been lost, and began building on a scale Japan could not match. American carriers fought back. Submarines strangled Japanese shipping. Island campaigns pushed closer and closer to the Japanese homeland. The defensive perimeter Japan hoped would force negotiation became a chain of battlefields. Then came Midway. There, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and many experienced airmen. The balance in the Pacific began to shift. From that point forward, Japan increasingly fought a defensive war against an enemy growing stronger every month. The consequences deepened. Japanese cities burned under bombing raids. Supplies collapsed. Civilians suffered. Soldiers were trapped on distant islands. The empire that had been built in the name of security brought destruction back to Japan itself. And finally came Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by surrender. Pearl Harbor had been imagined as the opening move of survival. In reality, it became the first step toward national catastrophe. The gamble won Japan a temporary advantage, but it awakened a power Japan could not defeat. So why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? The answer is not one simple cause. Japan attacked because its leaders believed delay meant defeat. They believed compromise meant humiliation. They believed their empire could not survive without oil. They believed the war in China could not be abandoned without destroying national prestige. They believed America was blocking Japan's rightful rise. They believed a sudden first strike might buy enough time to seize resources and force negotiation. In other words, Pearl Harbor came from a convergence of pressures: oil, China, militarism, imperial pride, fear of encirclement, political paralysis, strategic desperation, and above all, a catastrophic misreading of the United States. Japan did not attack because it expected to conquer America. It attacked because it hoped to break American momentum before that momentum became unstoppable. It hoped to create a temporary advantage and turn that advantage into a negotiated settlement. But the plan confused damage with defeat. It confused surprise with control. It confused American division with American weakness. That is the real reason Pearl Harbor happened. Japan's leaders chose war not because it was safe, but because every other option seemed to threaten the empire they had built. They saw the door closing and decided to smash through it. But on the other side of that door was not security. It was a larger war than they could survive. Pearl Harbor remains one of history's clearest warnings about power. It shows how nations can become trapped by their own ambitions. Japan wanted security, but pursued it through expansion. It wanted respect, but chose domination. It wanted resources, but seized them through war. It wanted to avoid slow decline, but launched a gamble that accelerated catastrophe. The tragedy is not that Japan's leaders saw no danger. Many did. The tragedy is that danger was understood and still accepted. Intelligent men looked at the risk, measured it, feared it, and moved forward anyway, because pride, ideology, and momentum had made retreat feel impossible. This is how history often turns. Not always through madness, not always through blindness, sometimes through decisions that seem logical inside a collapsing system, even while leading toward disaster. Pearl Harbor began with aircraft over a peaceful harbor, but its meaning stretches far beyond that morning. The smoke rising over battleship row leads forward to burning islands, ruined cities, shattered families, and the end of Japan's imperial dream. A tactical victory became a strategic disaster. A first blow became a death sentence for an empire. And the gamble that was meant to change history did change history, but not in the way Japan intended. Pearl Harbor was not only an attack, it was the moment when ambition, fear, and miscalculated power set the Pacific on fire. And its final lesson is still alive. A nation can win the opening move and still lose everything that follows. The ships at Pearl Harbor did not burn in isolation. They burned at the end of a long road, built from fear of weakness, hunger for empire, faith in military action, and the belief that one violent stroke could solve problems created over decades. That is why the story still matters. Because Pearl Harbor was not simply about one nation attacking another. It was about what happens when leaders mistake motion for strategy, pride for honor, and temporary success for lasting power. Japan attacked because it believed time was running out. But in striking Pearl Harbor, it gave time to its enemy, time to mobilize, time to build, time to remember, time to answer. The gamble that changed history began with surprise, but ended in ruin. And when we look back at that morning in Hawaii, we see more than burning ships. We see the terrible cost of a decision made by men who believed they had no choice, yet chose the path that made catastrophe certain. History does not only ask what happened, it asks why people believed it had to happen. And in that question, Pearl Harbor remains one of the most powerful warnings of the modern age.